Chapter 19. Zach sat on the flat bow in front of the controls, showing his son how to cast. These were the kind of moments he dreamed of having with his kid, among others, but he never imagined they would happen this way. He listened while Mark chattered, talking about his friends, games they played, the school he'd gone to before, the movie the other night, and more. Zach could tell that any and everything that popped into the boy's head came rolling out of his mouth. He was used to talking kids, so the sound didn't bother him, but he did zone out after a while, letting the boy talk while his mind drifted. He looked back to where Dani lay on a lounge seat near the back of the boat. It was hard to tell from here, but it looked like she was sleeping. A warm rush went through him knowing she trusted him with Mark enough to sleep while Zach watched him on the boat. "You like Mom, don't you?" Mark's voice drew Zach's attention back to him. "What do you mean?" Zach turned to Mark. "The way you look at her. It's the same way Becky looked at some of the 8th graders. She liked them and wanted to kiss them." Mark's nose crinkled with distaste at the idea of kissing a girl. Zach held back a chuckle. "I guess you could say I like her. I've known her since I was about your age, but until a couple weeks ago, I hadn't seen her in a really long time." "How come?" Mark tilted his head to one side. "You know your mom used to live near the lake, right?" "Yeah, she said something about that before we moved, but I didn't know before." "Did you know her then?" "I did." Zach took a deep breath, glanced over to where Dani slept and back to the miniature of himself seated beside him. "I went to school with your mom." "Did you know her well?" Zach was quiet, remembering Dani in high school, images of her flashing through his mind. Water skiing with friends, laughing on a picnic, just the two of them, stretched out on the back seat of the old beater he'd driven for the first few years as they lost their virginity together. He blinked and remembered where he was. "Yeah, I knew her well." Mark's eyes narrowed as he looked at Zach. He leaned close and his voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Did she really never get in trouble? She tells me she was so well behaved, her parents never had to get upset and ground her or anything." Zach couldn't help but laugh. That was not the question he'd been expecting when Mark had given him that look. "She was a good kid most of the time." "No one is all the time, but I knew her for a long time before they moved away, and I only remember her being grounded a couple times." Mark's shoulders dropped and he looked relieved. "I was afraid she was telling the truth and never got in trouble. I try to be good, but sometimes I just can't help but do something I know I shouldn't. Then she gets mad and yells. That doesn't bother me so much. It's when she gets sad and says real soft how she's disappointed that makes me feel bad. I try really hard not to make her do that." "I would too." Zach watched him a few seconds, wondering what had happened to make Dani tell Mark she was disappointed. He was about to ask when the tip of Mark's pole dipped, and the boy almost jumped to his feet in one hop. Mark talked him through setting the hook and reeling in the fish, staying close by in case he needed help. "Stand still and keep reeling," Zach said, reaching for the net he'd set nearby. He dipped the net into the water and scooped the fish out, lifting carefully so the sudden slack on the line wouldn't send the boy falling in the other direction. "He's a pretty good size, come see." He lifted the net up over the bow so Mark could see his catch. Mama, come look. I caught one." Mark yelled before coming closer. "What kind is it?" "It's a bass striped. He's not huge but he's good size." Mark marveled at the fish laying curled in the net. He reached to touch it, but pulled back with a jerk as the fish flipped in the net, trying to get away. "Show me, baby," Dani's voice made Zach turn to look at her. "Zach says it's a bass, a good one." Mark's excitement was contagious, and Zach was glad to see Dani at least pretended interest in what he was saying. She might not be interested in fishing, but she didn't let that keep them from doing it. He was thankful for that. "He's big. What are you going to do with him?" I don't know. Mark turned back to Zach. What are we gonna do? That depends. Do you like eating fish? Mark scrunched up his forehead and thought for a minute. I don't know. Zach looked to Dani, who nodded. Good. One of the best benefits of living around the lake were the fresh fish. It was part of what had brought him back after school, well that, and the hope that Dani might someday come back. Then how about we put him in the well, and have him for dinner? I can cook him up tonight after we get back. You don't have to feed us again, Dani said from where she stood between the open halves of the windshield. Can we really? Mark asked at the same time. It's up to your mom. Zach met her gaze. I'll be cooking anyway, and it's nothing to cook for 3 instead of 1, especially when it's fresh from the lake. I guess. Dani smiled. It will be nice not to have to worry about cooking for a change. You're welcome anytime. I cook almost every night, but it gets lonely eating alone. Zach thought he saw something in her eyes, but he wasn't sure what. She turned back and went back to her book, leaving him and Mark to deal with their fish and perhaps catch more. He wondered if he'd said something wrong, but now wasn't the time to ask. They had just finished dinner and Zach was cleaning up the kitchen with Dani's help, while Mark was busy investigating Zach's movie collection. I think it's time, she said as she rinsed dishes and loaded them into the dishwasher. Time for what? Zach frowned. Somewhere along the line she'd lost him, and he had no clue what she was talking about. To tell him who you are. She didn't look at him as she continued loading. Are you sure? He stopped and stared at her. His heart seemed to stop beating while he waited for her answer. I am. He likes you. That's big. The only reason I held off was because I didn't want to spring a total stranger on him. You're not that anymore. But how? We'll sit down and talk to him when we get done here. How's he going to take it? The idea that Mark might fight the idea made it hard to breathe. She stopped and turned to look at him. You're overthinking this. He's 9. He likes you. It will be okay. If you say so. He was trusting her here. He had to. She trusted him enough to tell Mark about the relationship. He had to trust her it was the right time. It crossed his mind that once Mark knew, he might get to take the boy to meet his parents. They would be over the moon. Together they finished cleaning and went into the other room. He was tempted to grab a beer from the fridge, but didn't want to start things off with Mark with alcohol, though it would calm his nerves just a little. He had made the decision to trust Dani, and that was what he was doing now. Zach sat in his recliner while Dani took a seat on the sofa. Mark, come over here a minute. I need to talk to you. What is it? He asked without moving from in front of the bookshelf where Zach kept the movies. Come sit down. She didn't ask again, and after a moment, Mark did as requested. You know I knew Zach a long time ago, right? Yeah, he told me this afternoon. Dani looked up at Zach. It was while you were napping. He asked what you were like in school, if you were always good. She gave him a narrow-eyed look as if she suspected he'd spilled all her secrets, but let it go and turned back to Mark. Yes, we knew each other when I was in school, before Grandpa Lloyd got transferred and we had to move to Phoenix. Okay. Mark looked back and forth between the two of them. He seemed to know this wasn't why he had to sit down and listen, and he was waiting for the rest of it. Dani took a deep breath. There were a lot of things that came between us, things that don't matter now and wouldn't interest you if they did. She stopped as if she didn't know how to say it. She looked at Zach, a pleading look in her eyes. He assumed from the look she was asking for help. Mark, he spoke up for the first time since they'd sat down, have you ever wondered about your father? Yeah, of course I have. I asked Grandpa Lloyd once a long time ago about him. He turned red and said it didn't matter, and not to bring it up again. It scared me, so I didn't. Anger at Dani's father flared inside Zach. How dare he take his own bad decisions out on an innocent kid? He forced himself to take a deep breath and let it out slowly so that he didn't say something he would regret later. How would you feel if we told you I'm your dad? Zach didn't know how else to say it. A glance at Dani told him she wore a slight smile as she looked back and forth between the two of them. I'd be really excited. You're fun. Are you really? Mark was animated and talking almost a mile a minute. His excitement was palpable. Are you really? Yes, baby, Dani said. Zach is your dad. Mark jumped up off the couch, flew to the recliner where Zach sat, and threw his arms around him. I've always been afraid my dad would be mean, and that's why he wasn't around, but you're not mean. Zach's chest was tight as he was filled with love for this sweet, innocent tiny human. Mark released Zach and stepped back, looking into Zach's face. Why weren't you there? When I was little, I mean? That's a little complicated, but the short version is that when your mom left, we didn't know about you. Things happened so that we lost touch, and I only found out when I met you at the park. Zach wasn't going to ruin the boy's image of his grandfather by giving him tales that didn't matter. Especially now that the old man was gone, and all it would do would be to tarnish his memory. You didn't know? Zach shook his head. Mark turned and looked at his mom. Why didn't he know? Things aren't always easy, baby. Sometimes big people fight, sometimes we do things that we figure out later aren't right. I thought he knew, but he didn't. Why he didn't isn't important, just that if he had known, he would have been there with us. Mark watched her for a second, then nodded, as if taking her word for it. Okay. What does this mean? Do I come visit now? I've been hoping that your mom might let you stay with me while she works, at least until school starts. How would you feel about that? Zach watched for signs that Mark might not like the idea. Like I come here instead of Aunt Sarah's? Exactly. Really? Mark looked back to his mom. Really, Mom? Could I? I don't see why not. But you'll need to mind Zach just like you do me, do you understand? I will, I promise. He turned back to Zach. When can I start? Mom is off tomorrow but works the day after that. Can I come then? You can. Can we go fishing again? Fishing is a possibility. I thought we might also go let you meet my parents, your grandparents, would you like that? Are they nice? A shadow crossed over his face for a moment, and before Zach could say anything, Dani leaned over. His dad is fun, he used to take me water skiing, and his mom is even nicer than Grandma. You'll love them and they'll love you. Her whisper wasn't as quiet as it could have been, and Zach heard every word. She's right. I am a little biased because they're my family, but they're yours too and they'll love you. I have more grandparents. Mark sat down on the couch, momentarily stunned. Not just grandparents but aunts too. I have 2 sisters. Wow. Do they have kids? Do I have cousins too? Not yet, Zach said with a shake of his head. But they're younger than me. One's still in school, and the other just graduated. That just means you'll be bigger and need to protect your cousins when they do come along. Seeing the boy's excitement made happiness unfold inside him, filling him with a sensation unlike anything he'd ever felt before. He liked it. Mark asked questions about Zach's family, and Zach and Dani did their best to answer them. For the rest of the evening, the movie was forgotten with much more exciting news. Zach hoped introducing Mark to the rest of his family went as smoothly.